All right, so welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon for our Sunday study. We're very blessed to be joined by Gimbiya Kettering, who, when I met her, she was the director of Intercultural Ministries for the Church of the Brethren. She's also in the past served with On Earth Peace. She's now active with the Women's Caucus of the Church of the Brethren, and she's a writer and just, all around amazing person with a prophetic voice for our time. And I reached out to her a couple months ago when we decided we were going to be having different sorts of guests just to talk some about. Okay, that was loud. Just to see what sorts of things she could be helpful for us as far as like what sorts of things could she speak into. And we might be having her back later for a more in-depth sort of discussion. But one of the things she mentioned was this idea of inequity in education. And so I thought it would be great because we had Michaela a couple weeks ago to talk some about what her church has done. I thought it'd be good to look at it on a broader scale. And Gimbiya is with us to do that. So welcome, Gimbiya. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really honored to be here. I have actually been to your church. I've been to Harrisburg First in person before a few years ago. And Josiah and I, we call each other all the time. We stay in touch. He's a big part of it. I went to private school. I think when we start a conversation about education, it's helpful to kind of locate yourself in that as well. I went to private school. And I went to private school in Nairobi, Kenya. So my parents are Americans. My dad's an American. My dad's Church of the Brethren, 8 generations. If you look in Brethren encyclopedias, you'll see pictures of my grandmothers and great-grandmothers, full-on prayer shawls, hair coverings.
Kettering,
Kettering, old, white, Ohio, dairy farming brethren. And he married my mom, and my mom is Black. So I am their biological child. And they got a job in Nairobi, Kenya. Not with the Church of the Brethren. And so we grew up there. There were 3 American schools in Kenya. One was Rift Valley Academy. It's up out of the main city. It is a missionary school. It's a boarding school. My mom said, no, I didn't have kids to send them away to boarding school. I want them here with me. And there were 2 American schools in the city. And one was a diplomat school, so it was the international school. It was all the diplomats sent their kids. There was basically an American IB hybrid program. And then the other was the American Missionary School Roslyn Academy, which is where my brother and I ended up going. We both graduated there. And that's my educational background, is a private school. It is a predominantly, and especially at that time, our family integrated the school. It was in Africa, and it was white missionaries in our family. And it was on Kikuyu land, and there were no Kikuyu students there. That's what it was. And so very early on, I had this sense that there's stuff happening in education that we're not talking about. And in many ways, I've sort of followed that conversation. I'm now a parent. I now have to make these decisions for my kids about where we go, where our kids go, and what does that mean, and how does that reflect our values? And I look at it very strongly through a question of my values. And my values as somebody who's Church of the Brethren is part of that. So this is what brings me into this conversation with you. As I mentioned, my parents are an interracial couple. And one of the really interesting things for me to realize is that my parents, when they would have started school, would have been attending, they're from different parts, they're from different countries, but had they both been in the same place, they would not have likely attended the same school in most of the United States. So that's how recently school integration happened. And I want us just to kind of sit with that, because it means that's true for a lot of us, that either in our generation or in the generation previous to us, we saw the legal shift of school integration. As we move forward, I'm hoping that all of you will talk. I actually really don't want to talk at you. I want to talk with you. So I encourage you, please speak up, raise your hand, or speak out. Feel free to, if you have a question, I don't mind being interrupted at all. And I'd like to be talking with people. But one thing that I do ask is that the first time you speak, that you share a little bit about your educational background, particularly looking at the K through 12. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the sort of post-high school experiences, but also look a little bit at the K through 12 as sort of where you are, because a lot of times we may not know that about each other. We meet each other later in life, and we haven't talked about some of those foundational experiences with one another. So this is a time where, as we talk, we can share that piece of our history with each other. And I just like to sort of start by asking, what are the questions that you bring to the table today? What are the questions that you are interested, or what questions do you have about education that you've sort of held on to? And it's not that I'm going to necessarily answer them, but I want to hear what's going on in the room. Or what are the points of passion that you have around this?
Yes.
So I guess I have, first, my name's Sarah Brenneman. I went to K through 8th. I went to public school in Idaho, where there were not private schools because the public schools were really good. And the Mormon Church believed that all people should be well educated. And Idaho is 90% Mormon. My 8th through 12th grade years were in Appalachian country in Western Maryland, where I went to public school, but my parents actually looked at putting me in private school because the public schools were so far behind. Mm-hmm. And women should not be educated. And so for me to be smart was very unfeminine.
Did they end up making that change, or did they keep you in public school?
They kept me in public school because the private school had a really bad basketball team, and I played basketball, and I didn't want to play for a team that was that bad. So I asked them to keep me in public school. But I guess what my question is, Gimbiya, after we had this speaker a couple of weeks ago, I'm an auditor and I audit nonprofits and local government. So on the Pennsylvania Department of Education, you can look at where all the funding for all the school districts come from. So that is what I did. And I was shocked to find out that Harrisburg City school districts have actually a higher funding ratio per student than some of the surrounding areas, but I know that the education is inequitable. So what makes it not equitable other than the funding?
This is a great question, and no, I'm writing it down. What makes it not equitable other than the funding? And we will definitely get into this. There's some really interesting things related to that. And so in this early stage, I am just kind of capturing questions because I think other people may have some questions that weave into this, and I don't want to start answering yours and kind of blow past. But thank you so much, and thank you for the basketball story. I love that. Because we do oftentimes make school decisions for things that might seem kind of not connected to learning or not connected to education. And that's a really great reminder of all the other factors that play into school.
Which reminds me of, I started school in a one-room school. There were two of us in my first grade class. Wow. And about 30 probably in the whole school, grades 1 through 8. One teacher taught all subjects for all 8 grades. And when I was in 6th grade, my parents and some other parents decided I was not getting a proper education because the township schools would not provide home ec, which I got at home, believe me. But so they petitioned the township to send the township kids to a school that was slightly larger, where we could get home ec. So, but what happened then was that they also had band, and they also had music teachers, and they also had, well, it was just totally different. But I mean, that was the reason that I got out of the one-room school.
And do you have a question also that you want to share? I love your story about, again, we're talking about specials. Nobody's talked about math or science or calculus yet, or I think home ec and basketball and band.
Well, I think, you know, the one thing that happened was that the schools were very small. And although I was a good student, I was told I should go to college. But nobody ever helped me to know, how do I do that? What
did you go
do to get into college? And so I applied for college, but I took my SAT tests, but I did not apply to any colleges because I didn't know you needed to apply. I thought if you had a good SAT score, they would just contact you and offer you a scholarship. So basic knowledge, and I don't know how much of that is true in like the city schools, but you know, just basic knowledge about how you get an education, I didn't have.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a really vulnerable thing to admit. Sometimes we oftentimes blame ourselves for the things we don't know, and then the ramifications of that can be a hard thing to admit. Thank you so much for sharing that, sister.
Federal withholding tax. If you elected to have taxes withheld from your benefits.
Is there anything that you heard from Michaela, who was the previous presenter, that really stood out to you, or that you wish you could have, like, now that you've had some time to think about it, that you want to follow up on?
I thought one of the things she shared that kind of stuck with me just had to do with, you know, real on a local level, like really reaching out to the schools that are here and talking to the people in charge of that local school, not necessarily like the whole administration, just to see how or if we as a faith community could make a difference for that local school. And I felt like that, you know, having those sorts of conversations it's like bite-sized sort of, as far as it's something that we can actually like do. And I guess one of the things that I'm excited to hear more from you, Gimbiya, today, just has to do with how to make a difference on a broader scale, you know, given what we can just readily see around us. I'm Josiah. I went to Central Dauphin High School, which is where Alan Benson taught science. So it was a public school.
I think I yelled at you in the hall somewhere.
I think so. I never had Alan in class, but anyway. So for me, it was just public school the whole way through. Just went to school where we lived. And I honestly, prior to having children of my own and living here, hadn't thought much about it. I just kind of thought, oh, well, you send your kids to school where you live, and that's just what it is. Until I noticed so many of my friends who had decided to intentionally live where I live, moving because they didn't want their kids to go to school where they live. And I've been learning a lot about that. I don't want to monopolize the time, but we've made a lot of decisions for our own family just based upon knowing how that really has impacted the neighbors that live here, when every family that has means is like, nope, and they roll, or they stay and send their kid to charter school, which siphons the money away. We've made decisions thinking that hopefully we'll be able to, you know, bridge the gap ourselves if there is a gap. And largely we've noticed that the teachers at our local school are amazing people. And, you know, our kids are getting, I mean, they're only, 5th grade in second grade, but they're getting educated, and a lot of these scary stories are at least not true for our family. So that's a lot.
That's a lot, and I really want to say, like it was having kids that really kind of took the conversation for me from a sort of theoretical social justice conversation to a whoa, what am I committed to moment, and that's a sobering moment as a family. Now, I'll tell you, I'm really happy to hear there's a teacher on the call too, because that's another very important perspective to bring in. Would you be open to sharing? Do you have something that you'd like to just sort of put on the table as we get started?
Yeah, I mean, I think for any teacher, it's always kind of a little bit of a mystery and a constant source of puzzlement as to why kids accomplish so much in school and why some don't get much out of it. And it's sometimes it's hard to see, and certainly, I taught at the school that Josiah went to for 27 odd years. And over that time, it became much more diverse in terms of the population, in terms of, Black and Asian and other people of color. And, it was just really kind of interesting to see that everybody's in the same setting, same building, same teachers, and there's just, big differences in accomplishment. And, because, and it's interesting, to the comment earlier about how Harrisburg spends a lot of money per pupil compared to a lot of the more affluent suburban districts around it. But, to me, there's certainly no direct correlation between what's spent and what learning takes place. That's not always, part of my early teaching experience, actually, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya, in fact, in Kikuyu territory, north of Nairobi. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, the schools there ran on next to nothing. And, I think I had some of my best moments as a teacher when we, we made lab equipment out of tin cans and scrap and whatever we could find. And that was some of my best moments, ever. Just so I don't know, the correlation between what you spend and the education takes place isn't straightforward. I guess that's what I would say.
Well, I'm a practicing educator and Harrisburg Community College, and I went to Pittsburgh Public Schools, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from K through about ninth grade. It was predominantly Black. We moved, and then from 10 through 12 was predominantly white. We had, back in the day, a whole lot of no-nonsense teachers. They were very serious about what we were up against. And they tracked in Pittsburgh at that time. And if you were in the higher groups, that you got more. It's college prep. I don't know if they do that anymore. So I believe the high school I went to was a very good high school, not the best in the city, but it was a very good high school, I thought. I went to college because the high school, everybody was going to college. But anyway, what Alan was saying, I'm reading a book by Bettina Love. You may have heard of her, from Atlanta, Georgia. She's got awards up and down both horns, went to a conference very recently, like on Friday. And she'll say, to answer Alan's question, it's the system, for Black, BIPOC is the word that's used, that she used a lot, for Black and brown kids, because they come here wanting to learn, but somehow by a certain age, things change, almost no matter where they go. And her answer is, it's called abolitionist teaching, is to destroy the system. It's the system. The system's the problem. It's got to be changed. And that's her impassioned plea. And hearing Alan speak, that's pretty much supporting what she said. My question is, how do you change the system?
Hi, I saw that we had somebody join us since we did our introduction. And I just want to say hi, my name's Gimbiya. And welcome. I told everybody feel free to interrupt me with your questions. We're giving people an opportunity to start with sort of what's on their mind related to education, if you have any opening questions. And if you do, the first time you speak, if you could also just say a little bit about your own educational background, that's really helpful.
Hi, my name is Remy. And I had my education in Nigeria. I'm from Nigeria, West Africa. So I had my education back in Nigeria from my nursery. That's like pre-K till I went off to college and got my first degree. And so I had everything back home before relocating here. So I'm not so used to the education system here, though my kids are in school here. And I've heard a lot about the differences in education, the way, like it's being said here. So I really want to know more about it, discrimination and all that. I really want to know more about it. We see a lot of things on the news, on TV, how kids get treated because of the color of their skin and all that. So, it gives me a kind of fear because I have kids. I'm like, God, we had it so good back home. I really hope, my kids, they get the value of education that I really, look forward to them having here. So that's the kind of fear I have at times. So I'm like, where's the best school district? Where could it be? But at the end of the day, it's what it is. It's just the system, like it's been said. So that's my take on it for now.
Does anybody on this call know when the US started having conversations about free public elementary school, like sort of pre-college education? Does anybody know when that started?
19th century?
Probably 1830s.
You're getting close. There was no free federally mandated. There were a couple of places in the US where you could find it on sort of like a community level. But federally mandated across the country, there was no conversation about free education for children until after the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And it started because they said, wow, we have all of these people, freedmen. We know there's a problem. We know they don't have resources. We know they don't have parents who can teach them to read. We know they can't afford tutors. We have all of these people that are amongst us. They're now living here. How are we going to educate these people? How are we going to make sure that they are productive members of society? How are they going to be able to vote if they can't read? Like, these were very serious questions during the Reconstruction era.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we need to set up schools for freedmen's children. And you can read, like, if you Google freedmen's children's schools, like, they just pop up all over the place. They had them, they tried. And white people said, wait, we don't get this. How dare you educate those people's children when our children don't have access to this? Prior to this, if your family was wealthy, you paid to go to school or you paid to have a tutor come into your home. And so that initial conversation about, like, there needs to be some kind of equity in this conversation around education comes after the Civil War, as there begins to be an attempt for equity for Black people. There is a woman, and I can't think of her name right now, but she's very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement at sort of the grassroots level. And she says, until Black women are free, nobody is free. And this is such an example that until Black mothers are confident in their education of their children, there was not actually a conversation that was freeing up anybody else to have that education. It was Black community leaders pushing that conversation in the US in a way that hadn't happened before.
Yeah,
Hi, I'm Donna. I'm also in education, special education, happy retired woman, but I still do a lot with education. I'm an English language learning tutor to adults, etc. Was also in the Peace Corps. But I just wanted to mention, as far as the schools, Alan and I were just down in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and we visited Mitchellville, which was one of the first schools for the freedmen and women. So that, and we saw.
Oh my goodness, have the voice.
Yeah. But anyway, so my school background, I went to the same high school as Alan, very excellent public school in this area, and never gave it another thought, mostly white, very good, went to an excellent college, private college, etc. But when we started thinking about equity and multiculturalism in education is more when we had a child living here in the rural northern York white area, and we had an Asian child that we adopted from Vietnam, and she was going to this high school, and there were not many people of color there. So our emphasis of continuing to go to church in Harrisburg City became even more important for us as a family trying to educate ourselves and our daughter in multiculturalism. And Josiah was her youth leader, and the children, the youth that she grew up were very multicultural, and that really opened our eyes and opened her eyes to the possibilities of equality and getting along with everyone. So the other piece is I worked in early education. So my question relates to how can we help the folks in Harrisburg with the early education. That's some of the reason the kids are getting into the school system already behind, because they haven't had a chance to go to maybe a private preschool, or there have been studies on numbers of books in people's homes, teaching literacy. All of that is important. And if you, not just color, but poverty, if you take poverty, the homes might not have as much literacy available for the kids, so they're coming in behind.
Economic.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's such a great question, because again, it really relates to this idea that it was this question about poverty and economic disenfranchisement that pushed the conversation initially. You guys are a faith group, you're a church, you're asking what difference can we make? I'd like to say the church has already made a huge difference in public education. A huge, amazing difference, and it made it there twice when the churches really made an amazing, profound 180 on education. And one was in the 1890s, as we begin to look at the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow era. Church groups pushed for the segregation of schools. Church groups said explicitly it is against the will of God for our children to be in this space together. Our Christian faith undergirded slavery, it undergirded every other racist system that has come from that point forward. And churches were very, very clear about that. And that's why I like talking about it with faith groups, because I think if we realize how powerful we were in helping create the system, we also can realize that we can be incredibly powerful in deconstructing the system and creating something new. The second time that churches were incredibly powerful was following the Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of public schools. One of the things we don't often talk about is the fact that white students just left public schools at that point. Sarah said she's from Maryland. Maryland is actually my parents' home state, where they had my brother and thought they were going to be. So they did a lot of research on the Maryland school system, and it's right around the corner from us. My parents were always like, "Will you move to Maryland?" So I think about that education system a lot. It has a really strong Catholic history and a very strong tradition of parochial schools. Maryland's parochial school system and the parochial and private schools around the country were designed to keep schools segregated. The vast majority of them were founded by church communities, faith communities, as schools where they could pick who entered and who didn't enter. And so as the federal government said public schools have to be integrated, parents pulled their kids out and sent them to private religiously based schools. And it's really important that we understand that's part of our legacy as Christians in America. And to understand that undoing that legacy is part of our faith work. And it can be really easy to look around and be like, but it wasn't me. It wasn't me. It's like, yeah, I know it wasn't me. But it's the communal strength that we had at that time. The reason why those schools are set up as nonprofits. There are other places in the world where private schools are seen as for-profit organizations. The reasons why they're seen as nonprofit have to do with the lobbying that happened during that time. Why do we have public school? Like why do we have school? Like why send kids to school? What's the purpose of that? My kid every week's like, can I homeschool? I have to give her a list of reasons why we are actually not homeschooling, and mom's sanity is like number 2. Like no, mom was like, I think time.
Well, it's partly a socialization.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like where I went to school, there was so little socialization because, I was the only girl in first grade. There were no girls in second grade. There were 2 girls who were older in third grade. The closest girl my age lived 2 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
So I had very little socialization. So socialization, I think, it's not only education, but also socialization, is that you learn how to live with other people.
Mm-hmm.
I think historically too, some of the push for universal education had to do with kind of the transfer from an agrarian society to an industrial society, where when everybody lived on the farm, there were kind of things for kids to do, and in the winter they could learn a little reading, writing, and arithmetic. But once people moved to the city and the parents are working in factories, you literally have to find somewhere for these kids to be.
Have to go somewhere. Yeah, this is a question of COVID, right? Like my kids are distance learning right now. That somewhere is with me. And the families are asking this question a lot. Like, I can't work and take care of a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, right? How are we supposed to do this? That question's really key. So we do this, and it's also interesting. One of the things we talk about with schools, we talk about it as a social mobility tool. You can come into school and you can go somewhere. If you study really hard, if you apply yourself, if you make something of yourself, good things will come. You'll have good jobs. You'll have sort of all these things. And this is part of our American story about school.
American dream, yeah.
The American dream, yep. The meritocracy, right? But in fact, it's oftentimes not as clear cut as that. And the other piece about the socialization that I love that you brought up is that's really important. We pick who our kids socialize with when we pick who they go to school with. Like I said, I live in DC. DC is one of the fastest gentrifying cities. So DC in the 80s was called Chocolate City because it was so black. Right now it's about half and half black, half white, sort of a few other things, but you're looking at sort of 40% each. So it's very quickly gentrifying. The white people who are coming in tend to be like two master's degrees, honestly, not even just like 2 college degrees, but like 2 master's degrees couples are coming in. House prices are going up, all of those things. And what we see among our friend group, but also what the city pattern has shown, is that people come and by 5th grade they pull out and they move to Bethesda, they move to Chevy Chase, these sort of neighboring Maryland towns where the school systems are significantly whiter. And I always tell my husband, I said, I think it's very interesting that's like 4th and 5th grade. Like before you start dating, I want to make sure that you are not here. Like it's okay for you when you're little. And what to me is really interesting about that is it's actually a very old American pattern. So if you look at how slave owners educated their own children, you know, almost every slave owner will tell you, like, I grew up around black children. They were my playmates. But then I went away to college, and like these great American institutions of colleges were set up so that by dating age, you've got somewhere to go to be with your real peers. This is a super, super old system and a super, super old pattern. And that's why it's really important to deconstruct it. So, are you guys feeling up for watching like a really short video with me?
Sure.
Okay. We're going to try this.
To draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was...
I know that didn't work. Hold on. Josiah and I practiced this and I like totally got my order wrong. Josiah, are you going to give me a thumbs up if it works?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Hey. Nobody said they couldn't hear, so I'm going to assume everybody could hear.
I heard it good. I had a question with the with Sarah's question earlier about like the amount given to Harrisburg City versus surrounding. Would one of the explanations possibly be that those surrounding school districts get so much more from the property tax thing, and so they don't need as much? It's just a question.
What I was looking at federal, state, and local funding, and Lancaster County made sense to me. Lebanon County made sense to me, and Dauphin County did not seem to make sense. So I was looking at it. I looked at a couple of different counties just to see if like the funding, the percentage spent on children made sense. And every other county made sense in what I would have expected. The city schools were receiving less funding per student. Not in what's right. I'm not right. Justifying. It was what I expected.
Understood.
The city schools were spending less per child, and the surrounding richer school districts had more because it was looking at federal, state, and local funding. And Dauphin County, Harrisburg City, the report on PDE's website showed that they were receiving more funding. Now, I don't know if there's more children getting sent to charter schools, because I do know for a fact that every child that goes to a charter school, the local school district has to pay a ridiculously large amount for each of that, and that's pulling funds away. And so I wasn't able to like get that information from what I was looking at, and it was hard to read even for someone that reads it. And I looked at some of the schools that I audit to see if the numbers made sense, and they do. They line up with the audited financial statements.
So there are a couple of things that happen that are really interesting. One of the presentations I went to when I was like learning about the DC school system, and they said, you've got to imagine every kid has a backpack of money on their back, and every school wants that kid to come in with that backpack of money. And DC has also got a very robust charter school program and system. And your kid has like X amount. I want to say in DC it's like $11,000. It's actually quite high per kid. And then if your kid has an IEP, they get a certain amount more. Now, DC has had massive lawsuits about IEPs. IEP is an individual education program. It's for kids who have anything that's going to slow down their learning. Also, if your kid has had any run-in with the system, if it's whether it's foster care or juvenile, anything that's put them on the blip will also add money to their backpack. So there's ways in which kids that are already the most disadvantaged because they have IEPs and are in foster care, like they're going to get a bigger number in their DC backpack, but their outcome is not going to be great for their education. Like that's the reality of foster care. That's the reality of whatever it is that's disrupted your life to create that. The other thing that happens in DC that's really fascinating is there was a huge push among parent advocates that PTAs across the city should be able to fundraise, and you should be able to keep half of what you fundraise at your local school. And the other half should go into a common pot across the city and get divided across all schools. Now, the school that is closest to my house and is inbound for my kids is Minor Elementary's fundraising. The year that I last looked at it was about $700 by the PTA. There's a school that's literally a 25-minute walk from my front door, but across Capitol Hill on the white side of Capitol Hill. And they make $7 million in PTA fundraising. And you can imagine how they felt about half of that getting put into a common pot. So, the level of access to parents, like when you go to their fundraising for their gala, like they're like, oh, you can stay at our house at the Hamptons. And like, that's what you're like, when you're doing your silent auction bid, that's what you're silent auctioning bidding on. They've got parents who apply for grants, who basically treat applying for grants for their kids' schools as full-time jobs and just volunteer that time. And then we had like our school where like, they're like, oh, we're doing a bake sale. Can you come on Friday? We're doing a car wash, right? Like, you just can't compare. It's apples to oranges. And so, yeah, Watson has like extra school art activities, right? They have a different language program than Minor does. Like, all of these things begin to play out because the PTA is pulling this huge amount of money. The other thing when we talk about equity, when you talk about like my 3-year-old, like she goes to school, like you can pass my 3-year-old a book and she knows which way is up and which way is upside down. Not all 3-year-olds know that. And that's just, sort of what's the home support? What does it mean? My kids have a stay-at-home mom. We're talking about this a lot with COVID. Like my kids have a stay-at-home mom who's there overseeing their Zoom school and making sure their homework gets done. I'm not the norm. Mm-hmm. I am not the norm. And the same thing was true pre-COVID. When you look at, people talk a lot about Flint. If you are drinking poisoned water, there's a guy in DC who sells books that he writes and illustrates himself. And they're all about the fact that he is a child who has lead poisoning and actually can't get a mainstream job because he couldn't finish school, because he grew up in a part of the city where lead was just common. And he remembers tasting lead in the paint of his crib. And he said it tasted sweet, right? Like, and he says like that. And so, yeah, like that is, and that's sort of pre all the IEP stuff. He's a guy older than I am. How did that generation, and when he has kids, what happens? How does environmental pollution impact our outcomes? So yeah, there's a lot of granular difference between each kid's situation and also where the money goes. And I have a good friend who works for a philanthropic organization, and she's one of their consultant auditor kind of people, and she helps them apply their grants more effectively. And she called me the other day and she said, Gimbiya, I'm sitting in this room. Everybody in this room is talking about public school education, and they're talking about food. Like, how do we get food to kids in Zoom? Kids that would normally be getting school food, right? And she said, I looked around and I thought about the salaries of all these people in the room. And she said, if you just fired everybody, you could feed a whole school district for a year. Right? Like, just fire everybody. There's your solution right there. And there's all kinds of hangers onto school systems, charter school systems. The public schools talk about charter schools talk about this with public schools. There's all kinds of people in the system who are insulated and drawing salaries that is not going directly into your kid's education. I'm going to look at your questions a little bit. So the correlation between money. The other thing that's really interesting is, so they talk about implicit bias in that video, which I really, really, really like. And they talk about implicit bias sort of after you get out of the system. But what do you think is the impact of implicit bias while we're in the system?
I mean, I can say personally that, like, my kids' teachers assume the best of them all the time. And I can't prove that they don't assume the best in other kids in this class, but Like when we did the gifted testing, for instance, it's like, yeah, he didn't do that well on this part, but that's just because of blah, 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 blah.
He's not a good test taker, but we know he's
like that. I'm like, are you doing that for the, And so that's kind of the reverse in some ways, but I also noticed that my kids are called on. Like I see all the kids raising their hands. My kids are the ones getting called on.
So yeah, implicit bias in the school system really matters. I integrated a white school, and I was not the valedictorian of the class, and I really kind of puzzled over that for a long time. I was super driven, super competitive, like you name it. And I had those stay-at-home parents that like worked with me, and I read early like all the markers, right? And Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot. If you read any of Malcolm Gladwell's books, he talks a lot about education at various times. And one of the things that comes out is that teachers who are reading the papers of kids who are grading them tend to grade Black kids harder. So in pre-K and nursery school equivalents, it starts out with like two little boys bite one another, right? The Black kid is more likely to get suspended and or expelled. And more likely, like 200% more likely compared to white kid, like fourth graders. So they talk about like the police presence in predominantly Black and brown elementary schools. Like what are police doing in an elementary school? And they'll talk about classrooms where they'll have like fourth graders in solitary where they wait for the police to come. And I'm like, what has an 8 or 9-year-old done to be waiting in solitary for the police to come take them out of the school? And every few months, a YouTube video goes viral, and you can like watch Black kids be arrested in school. Now, I went to an all-white school. Like I was one of like 3 Black kids in like my middle school, like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I was one of like 3, and I watched white kids set things on fire. I watched them torture animals. This is not like they did horrible things. They called each other's names, like you name it, like horrible things. It was missionary school. Everybody's parent went to seminary. I mean, like kids are kids. They're kids who are going to do horrible things. They're kids who are not, like, but the consequences are different. And one of the things we talk about a lot as parents of color, my husband and I, is that our kids don't have a lot of room to make that kind of mistake. A mistake. I've got white cousins who took off like 2 years to like go smoke pot in Europe and came back and finished college. My parents didn't even put that option on the plate for me. Like, there is no room for failure. There's nothing to catch you in the system. And so that's a huge part of it. But the other thing that happens implicitly, and my mom also, I want to say to Remy, who was asking sort of about this, my mom's a Jamaican, so she grew up, and there were definitely things by British colonialism that shaped Jamaica's education system. Like, there's no doubt about that. But she grew up as a Black person with Black teachers and Black headmistresses, and like everybody was Black in her school. So she it was different, and she worried about that a lot. So my heart is just going out to you so much because I know how my mom struggled with that. And it impacts how you see yourself. And how you see yourself actually was the basis of the Brown versus Board of Education. Has anybody ever seen the Brown versus Board of Education? Like, have you read through the transcripts or anything? So there was this child psychologist called Kenneth, I want to say his name was Kenneth Clark. But he's this child psychologist. He worked with Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall brought the case. And this was before he was a Supreme Court justice, of course. He was a young lawyer. He brought this case to the Supreme Court as part of an NAACP. It was actually like a lot of school districts that were brought together. And Brown was just the B, like it's alphabetical, right? Linda Brown's father was also a pastor. One of my favorite facts. And one of the things they did was they said, this is damaging children's sense of themselves. And I want to show you the video. So the video is actually, they did not take video footage of this in 1958, but I want to say it was Sidney Poitier. So it was like the early 70s. They did a movie about this and they recreated from his notes that scene. And they have also used, it's called the doll experiment. And they have used that doll experiment. And this is sort of a agglomeration of a lot of different people who've done it. from like the 1970s till mid 2000s. So fairly recently, and I wanted to share that with you. And then we're going to do a time. We should do a time check. It's 3 o'clock. Are people good for video?
Doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and you have two eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with?
This one. I like that one.
Okay.
This one.
That one?
I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
She's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you give, and why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you?
Out of the 21 children preferred the white doll.
Yeah, that one.
Which one?
This one.
Why do you want that skin color?
Because I don't know. I don't know.
Not sure?
No.
What do you think of that skin color?
Well, it looks kind of whitish, and that's all I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too. Why do you want that skin color?
Because it looks lighter than this kind, because this looks a lot like that one.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I just don't like the way brown looks, because the way brown looks really nasty for some reason, but I don't know what reason. That's all.
So you think it looks nasty?
Well, not really, but sometimes.
Sometimes. And Brielle, they asked what color adults don't like. Do you remember what you said? Which one? That's right, that's what you said. Why do you think adults don't like that color?
Dark.
Dark. And adults, you think adults don't like dark?
Well, maybe some adults do, but maybe some of them don't.
And then which was the ugly child?
So show me the smart child. Okay, why is she the smart child?
Because she looks like me.
Okay. Show me the mean child. Okay, why is she the mean child?
Because she's way darker.
Okay. Show me the good child. Why is she the good child?
Because I think she looks like me.
Okay. Show me the bad child. Why is she the bad child?
Because she's a lot darker.
Show me the ugly child. Why is she the ugly child?
Because she's like a lot darker.
¿Cuál muñeco es bonito? ¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Cuál muñeco es malo?
Ninguno.
¿Cuál muñeco es malo?
Este.
¿Y por qué?
Porque, bueno, este es morena y este es blanco.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué?
Porque a mí no me gusta el color café.
¿Cuál muñeco te gusta más?
Este.
¿Cuál muñeco es bueno?
Este.
¿Y por qué?
Porque no me dan miedo los güeros porque tengo más confianza con los un poco más así como este. No tengo mucha confianza.
¿Cuál muñeco es malo? ¿Por qué?
No sé.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo?
Este. No sé, es que me parece que está un poquito, ¿cómo te diría? Más moreno y no se ve tan blanco. Y no tiene mucho aspecto.
¿Por qué el muñeco blanco es bueno?
Porque sus ojos son azules y todo su cuerpo es blanco.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué?
Porque está negro.
¿Por qué ese muñeco es malo?
Porque está café.
¿Y por qué que este café es malo?
Porque pega.
¿Cuál muñeco te gusta más?
Blanco. Porque sus ojos están bonitos y su raza también.
¿Cuál muñeco se parece más a ti?
Un poquito a este. Es que soy un poquito güerita de mis piernitas y de mi espalda y de mi carita y mis bracitos los tengo morenitos.
¿Cuál muñeco se parece más a ti?
Este.
¿En qué?
Las orejas. Sí, vamos.
Why is she the bad child?
Because she's black.
And why is he the ugly child?
Because he looks like he's white.
Why is he the dumb child?
Because she has dark brown skin.
Why is she the bad child?
Because she makes fun of everybody else's skin color.
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like. And show me the child who has the skin color most adults don't like. Dumb child.
Dumb child.
Okay, why is she the dumb child?
Because she has black skin.
Show me the mean child. Why is he the mean child?
Because she's brown.
Show me the bad child. Why is he the bad child?
Because he is black.
Okay. Show me the ugly child. Why is he the ugly child?
Because he's black.
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like. And show me the child who has the skin color most adults don't like. Show me the child who...
It's a lot to take in. Every time I watch it, I start over with like, whoa.
It's terrible.
A lot to take in. Terrible.
What can we do? This group that's gathered together here, we have 3 people who have children, 3 plus you. The rest of us are old fogies. Or whatever.
My children are surrounded by a lot of old fogies, so there's a lot you guys can do for my kids.
Right, yeah.
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I am a huge advocate for the difference we can actually make for the children in our community. And that literally means each other's children and grandchildren. Remy spoke up. She said, I have children that are in this system. I don't know how to do this. She has a lot of work to do, and she's an example of somebody who has a lot of work to do. Donna talked about sort of the decisions she made as a mother, also facing questions around race and how hard those questions were and some of the choices that she was facing. Like nurturing the families is really, 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 really a place that you can make a hands-on difference. And I will also say it can be the place where you can make a 20-year difference. And you can make a 20, it's sort of like it's that 20-year difference for one kid, right? And that is really amazing. That is really amazing. When I look at the work of God, like it is also just one person at a time, right? It's the 99 sheep and we're going out for that one. And the work of God's that one. And the work of the community is that one. And it is, every one of these, both of these videos said sort of check your internal bias. How is that impacting you? But it's also thinking about what are the biases that kids are starting to form? And how is it hurting them? And how can we help them heal with that? And that's literally the first kids. And then I think Kayla talked to you sort of about that second layer of stuff, which is like your local school district. What is your local school? What's a school that, is inbound for your church address? And I know that she talked about that a little bit. And then the bigger question that James brought is sort of like, how do we change the system? So like no kid has to do this. And no kid has to go through this. And I think this is the really complicated one because it's so much bigger. It's so much harder. I remember I told my brother once, if I won the lottery, this is when I was like really struggling with my kids in our school decisions. If I won the lottery, I would give it to DCPS and they would fix anything. And my brother's like, if you win the lottery, like DCPS budget is X billion, like it's millions of dollars. What do you think you're going to do with your $4 million? Like that's like 2 weeks operating budget for them. And he's like, that's nothing. Like you can't change a system with that. I am a huge believer that the best way to do it is actually to look at people who have figured out and have some strategies and ask them how to be their ally. So when you look at who's speaking out about education equity in Pennsylvania, how do you ally that? And when you look at who's speaking out about education nationally, how do you ally that? I'm somebody like I get text messages to my phone because of the phase of life that I was in. They're like, call your senator today. I'm like, I live in DC. Our senator doesn't vote, but okay. Those things really, really, really do actually matter a lot. And it's that sort of work that just feels so like, am I making a difference? And that's why I always really say, like, you have to balance like the 20-year vision of the kids that you can impact. And also that sort of big picture stuff that you may never see the impact of. But just that faithfulness to say like, okay, I'll send another letter. I'll call and leave a voicemail again. I see Josiah nodding. I see Juanita nodding. Juanita, you asked, is it still true that people don't know how to get to college? It is still very true that people don't know how to get to college. It's oftentimes true that even because of implicit bias, the people around them will think they may not be college material. And then the other thing that's really interesting is the difference between people who are first generation to go to college and people whose parents and grandparents went to college.
Yep.
People who know how to get to college don't always know how to stay in college. It was nothing for me to go to a teacher and be like, why'd you give me a B? I think I should have gotten an A. And James, you're nodding your head. You know this student, right? You've had me in class before. You're looking like, yes, I know you. And then there are other students who would never dream of making that call and ask because they've never had anybody tell them they can. And so that's something also that you can make a difference for as you begin to get to, but again, that's that one-on-one knowing people, making a difference to people in that setting.
I've always been happy that our church has been helping kids because, you know, I know that there are times you don't know. I mean, I did end up going to college, but I was not encouraged at all. It was like, why would you want to go to college or just get married and have kids? You don't need an education for that, you know. And so I think, you know, part of, and there are kids, I'm sure, that probably get that same kind of reaction. And so part of what we need to do is to help to encourage them that, you know, they do need an education. Not everybody probably needs to go to college, but they do need an education and to find some kind of schooling that will prepare them for life. You know, whether it's a vocational school or college, but
something that's happened, Gimbiya, in our faith community, one of those like kind of small things is I think it was Donna, but I don't want to speak out of turn, had a vision years ago for we have these young people who are able to go to school. They don't have somebody in their life to sign on the line to be able to get the loan that they need to go to school. Like, we should be working with our networks to try to raise money to be able to offer some financial assistance so kids can go to college. And so, I mean, there's 3 kids right now, after like 5 years of this, that you were talking about a 20-year impact. I imagine the 2 young ladies in particular that are going to have bachelor's degrees in large part because of that. And who knows how that will impact their kids and their kids' kids and so on. And so that's some of that little bite-size stuff, guys, that is already happening, which is good.
Well, aren't you working with kids too, also to help them to know how?
Yep.
You know,
yeah, that's the other piece is just like the, you know, applying and
right.
You know, even working with them once they're there, who to talk to.
I hear a kid crying.
Problem.
Speaking of kids, I'll be right back.
Okay. We just see. So, just for instance, some of it is just being in somebody's life and knowing what's going on, you know, and being able to sort of navigate things. So, I won't get into the details, but essentially, Sierra came to a place where, because of something that her advisor had told her, which was not true, she all of a sudden needed to make some moves to be able to graduate on time. And those moves then ended up costing her thousands of dollars. And she would have just tried to figure out how to pay it if she hadn't had like our scholarship fund and then also just people like me in her life to say, hey, what should I do? This doesn't seem right. And then me to go contact my friend at Messiah, who's in a role that he'd be able to tell me, you know, is this right? And he's like, no, that's not right. You want to contact the person in this position, and this position, and this position. And he even told me, copy all of them on the one email so that they all know who else you're telling about this, and you're going to get an answer. And within a week, she had like 3 different options for scholarships and grants, that because it wasn't her fault. And in fact, she took the steps necessary to like fix it other than the money. And so that's just a short anecdote of, if she didn't have the scholarship fund, if she didn't have us, you know, looking out for her, who knows what that could have been grounds for her not graduating. Honestly, not graduating with a semester left. How awful would that be, you know? And so, anyway, just a quick how that the little small impacts we've been able to make in certain lives, and you know, they will have a lasting impact for those folks.
I'm glad that Gimbiya said that one of the things we can do is to love on these kids. And since that's part of my job description as Grandma Romaine, I've been doing that and will continue to do that. So.
And love on the moms. I just really want to say love on the moms. Motherhood, even pre-COVID, could feel really lonely, but like in this era, motherhood can feel really lonely.
Yep.
It can be really hard to like do it alone. And I oftentimes say like we all love the idea of babies, but we're like not like it's like our maternity leave policy, right? Like what? 2 weeks later, you're not ready to come back to work. 6 weeks later, you're not ready to come back to work. 6 weeks in, you have no clue what's up as a mom, so I don't know how you're supposed to go back to work. But you know, like really also when you support a mother, and it can be really easy to support kids because kids can seem really virtuous and kids can seem really innocent. And we can look at the moms and be like, oh, it's your fault that you've been in this situation, or it's your fault that something's going on this way. Especially when we look at kids who are in disadvantaged spaces and have disadvantaged parents. And we can be like, oh, but in fact, if you're not loving the mom, the child sees that. And the child sees that you're blaming the mom. And every child loves their parents. And I just think that's a really sort of like missing puzzle in a lot of social justice work, and a lot of like education advocates are like, oh, the kids need this. And I think about a lot like with school lunches, right? We'll feed the kids, we'll feed the kids, we'll feed the kids. I'm like, well, what good does it do to feed the kids if the parents are hungry? And why is it that we don't trust the mothers? Why don't we give the mothers, like I know what they were paying for my kids' school lunch, and they'd like get bologna sandwiches. And I'd be like, wouldn't it be better to give the moms some of that money and say like, make your kids what they want to eat, what they recognize, what is food that is true to their culture, like is it rice and beans, like whatever that is, and teach kids like the home economics of it. Like, but we sort of had this sort of like, oh, it's a corporate packaged in plastic solution, because we have a hard time trusting the parents, and because we don't trust poor people. Like we actually have a system that actively doesn't trust poor people and thinks they are insufficient to manage their own. And it's why, if you look at like, why do certain kids get pulled out of their parents' households in disproportionate numbers? Like all of that stuff, it's really old.
I wanted to mention when Gimbiya was talking before about, you know, coming alongside those doing the work locally, and how that can be something that we can pursue. We will have an opportunity to hear about some of that, I think in 3 weeks. I'll let you know when I nail down the date, with a couple people that have already been worshiping with us. You know, most of you, I think, know Chloe, and Sunata has started visiting since the pandemic. She actually was with us for some of this today as well. But Chloe and Sunata are with Free Together, and they've been doing a lot of work locally in the state of Pennsylvania around equity for education. And so we will be able to at least hear some of what some local leaders are doing in a few weeks too.
I often have to think of Hilda Gibble, who was a teacher who was in our congregation for years. And she taught in city schools for years and years and years. And then towards the end of her teaching, she got a position in Cumberland Valley schools. And she said, I could not believe the difference in resources I had. Mm-hmm. She said, you know, I had everything I could possibly want, every resource I could possibly want to teach when I was in Cumberland Valley. And she said, resources that we just did not have in the city schools. And I think that does make a big difference in education too, when you have, when you're provided with the resources to teach well.
I think some of what Gimbiya was saying with implicit bias, and just I've heard even people that work at our schools here say things like, well, yeah, in this school district, they give out tablets, but we won't give our kids tablets because they'll just break them. Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm sure that kids in these other school districts are breaking their tablets too. Like, what is that the excuse? You know, anyway.
No, it's a really great question. Sort of like how do we advocate for resources in our school system? I will tell you. So there were a group of 3 white parents. Actually, it was a group. It was 3 white families that committed to sending their kids to the all-black middle school. So they were not going to move to Chevy Chase. They weren't going to send their kids to St. Peter's. They were going to send their kids to T.S. Eliot Lake. No, it's Eliot Hines. And it was the middle school. And this was pre-COVID, so like 2019. And I went to meeting after meeting with one of the white dads who's a lawyer. And I was like all up in arms about like equity, about things like tablets and stuff, right? And teachers and all this stuff. And his thing that he came to every meeting with was doors on the boys' bathroom stalls at Eliot Hine. Eliot Hine, a middle school bathroom, the boys' bathroom, they did not, and the boys had broken, some boy had broken, and therefore no other boy would ever be allowed to have, like, that was literally the mentality of, like, some ungrateful boy broke the bathroom door, and we're never going to fix it. Like, that was fundamentally underpinning the, like, we don't have resources to fix it. Like, doors get broken and fixed all the time, everywhere. Like, why not here? What's the underpinning bias? And how does it make every other kid who walks into that bathroom without a door feel? And I watched this guy for like 3 years. I was with this guy because his son was in the elementary school, and he had committed that he was going to send his son to this school. And I watched him come to meeting after meeting with the mayor, with this head of city council, like all these people. And, they got doors eventually. And what's really interesting about that is he wasn't the first parent to talk about it. Like, how many Black parents do you think talked about it that the system didn't hear? But white lawyer dad was heard. And literally the year before his son started school, that summer, bathroom doors were up. White adults advocating for schools of color make a difference. And one of the things that we didn't even get a chance to talk about is, like, we have desegregated schools by law, but 70% of Black and brown kids go to schools that are more than 70% Black and brown. We have de facto segregation in most of our school systems. And when you go to an all-white school like I went to, they'll tell you, like, oh, no, it wasn't segregated because Gimbiya was there. And I was like, Gimbiya and Khalil and who? Like, right? Like, it was very much a segregated system. But they didn't see it because I was there. But I felt it because I was like, dude, I am Ruby Bridges every day. And they also don't see it because they don't see the Black and brown schools. I'm going to send out sort of some resources that I have, and I will tell you there are great, like I said, Malcolm Gladwell does both books, chapters of his books are dedicated to this. He has a podcast where certain episodes are dedicated to this. There's one set in Chicago, I think it's room 405, that's all about this from, it's a part of American life, so like an NPR system. Jonathan Kozol wrote Savage Inequalities. Have any of you guys heard of Jonathan Kozol? He was a New York Times reporter, investigative reporter. He did like 2 articles on schools and ended up doing a lot of, like, 2 books about schools. And the one that, so when I read Savage Inequalities, it was a late 90s book. He said he would go to the airport in the towns where he would be doing his reporting and ask the taxi drivers, and he's a white reporter, he'd ask the taxi drivers to take him to the schools that he wanted to go visit. They'd be like, oh no, I can't drop you off in there, that's too dangerous. He's like, how do we have kids going to schools and places we think are too dangerous to drop an adult man? And he just writes about it such granular detail because he's an investigative reporter. He's so smart about it. So there's a lot of ways and a lot of different people talking about it that you can really see the conversation. That's very, very, very thoughtful. And everybody says sort of the same things, like check your implicit bias and how that's informing what you're seeing, what you're interpreting, and just how powerful that can be for the kids around you, to be aware that kids are growing their own implicit bias as we speak. And then what can you do for the kids that are in your immediate community? What can you do for the school in your immediate community? And how can you help people who are trying to change the big picture do that work? Like, that's kind of the layers. So it's like really inside your own self. And you guys are amazing for showing up here, because even admitting that there's a school problem requires believing that our implicit bias may have not shown us the truth. And that's already such, like, it's the first step of work, but I oftentimes think it's the biggest.
Gimbiya, I just finished reading a book called Biased.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who the author is because I don't have it, but it was a great way to continue to check my implicit bias and to realize some things that I didn't realize I was biased about. And so I felt like it was a really good read, and just something to throw out there that sometimes it's good for us to learn what our implicit biases are, because we don't always know what they are because we grew up with them, right?
That is really, I mean, the thing about your bias is that you're really blind to it. You don't know what it is. So one of the things that's really interesting for me is my husband is Asian American, Chinese, Singaporean. So, like, I grew up knowing, you want to talk about black and white issues, I can talk about them all the live long day. You want to talk about immigrant issues, I've got you, I am right there. I knew nothing about Asian American life experience until I met him. And I very much committed myself to reading, like, every big Asian American book I read before I got engaged, because I was very committed to that. And so now we had these shootings in Atlanta 2 weeks ago. And as a mom of Asian American daughters, whoa. And I've been reading sort of what people said, and I was like, oh yeah, I actually have heard this before. Like, I was already like, oh, this is not a new conversation for me. Because I'd already done that reading. I'd already had some like social historical context on that. And it was really, really very helpful because I did not enter the conversation, or I should say, rather, I entered the conversation and got to sort of watch it unfold with a little more awareness. And so then I was able to take other steps. And like, even as somebody, like, this is so intimate to my life that I'm like married into it, but I didn't start studying it until I was in my 30s. So it takes time. Like, it was new to me when I started thinking about it, because I always like Asian model minority bias. Like, what problems could they possibly have? They're not black. Like, that was really, really true to my bias. And it took like intimately engaging with it for me to really explore and unpack that. And it wasn't because like, oh, I'm friends with this guy, he's going to educate me. Like, no, actually, I had to educate myself to be with him.
I wanted to say one thing, this kind of goes back a little ways to the kind of redlining of the thing that was in the video there. But the school district that I taught in and that Josiah went to had two high schools, Central Dauphin and Central Dauphin East. The two high schools were less than a mile apart. And I was like asking somebody who'd been around a while, why do they have two high schools so close together? And the bottom line, what it boiled down to was one school drew from kind of very white, middle class neighborhoods where people owned their own homes. The other school drew primarily from areas where it was all rentals and apartments. And it was, ethnically more diverse and all that. And that, that whole discussion, that persists to this day, because every so often when they have to adjust feeder patterns for which elementary schools send which kids where, there's always a huge battle. And it's always couched in terms of, well, I don't want my kid riding the bus too long, or this is the school that's close to our neighborhood. But the bottom line, and the kind of thing that's never really, well, there's some people that would say it, is it's about who they want their kids going to school with. Mm-hmm. And, the kind of, the racial and ethnic distribution.
Why wasn't funding different?
And there's actual bias against like the poor white kids too with that, in that if you see the way that school district map is drawn, it's like this, and so it's like the kids living over in Appalachia kids are in with the city kids. Like, they couldn't be farther apart in any other geographically, culturally, couldn't be farther apart, except they go to school together. And then all the middle class white kids are here. Except if your kid's good at basketball, then maybe we'll, pretend like he lives over here.
But I mean,
it's a mess.
It's not ancient history. I mean, it's still going on. That's what
it's definitely. So we've got very good friends my husband went to grad school with, actually, and they all stayed in the DC area. And they live 7 blocks from us, and their kids go to the other school. which is now like 80% white, compared to our inbound school, which is 92% African American. And their homes on that, like, it's the third block, 300 block of Tennessee Avenue, and I live on the 500 block. Like, that's where the dividing line is. Houses on the 300 block of Tennessee Avenue sell for $50,000 more than our house because they're inbound for that school.
Which goes to that whole generational wealth thing too.
And all of these things, like, it's so interwoven
together.
It's so interwoven, and you know, how do we break it? When do we break it? And in some ways, you know, I think it's, you know, like, I just keep waiting to wake up and read like defund schools is like going to be the next headline, because really, like, how do you like take a system, and we've tried to fix the system by incremental steps, and there's so many unintended consequences to every fix. So even when you look at like desegregation of schools, do you know they fired every Black teacher in most school districts? So the assumption was like white teacher, like, what Black kids are going to go to white schools, which are better resourced. And this is like 1958 to 62, right? Like, that's what's going to happen. And school districts literally just fired Black teachers en masse. And at that point, teaching was one, like, if you were a Black, well-educated, ambitious person, teacher was like, Black teachers were considered some of the best, because it was one of the few jobs open to you. You could be a doctor or a teacher in Black communities. Like, those were the two jobs. And so mostly smart Black men became doctors and smart Black women became teachers, right? Like, and all of a sudden those jobs were gone. And you can, like, I know people whose teachers, when the Black teachers started being rehired down the road, their teachers would be rehired, and you'd find out, oh no, they were the principal at a Black school and they were now like the second grade teacher. Like, that's the kind of demotion. And that was when integration got better. and that long-term legacy impact of that. And so even when we talk about like No Child Left Behind, what were the unintended consequences of that? A friend of mine who's a teacher says one of the unintended consequences is we looked around and we said, oh, well, if you need to go to college, then you need to have X, Y, and Z. Well, that means if you're Black and you're in danger of getting left behind, we have to make sure you have that in the 10th grade, which means all your 10th grade stuff is getting pushed down to your 8th grade. And that means you're expecting your pre-Kers, how do you expect your pre-Kers to have sight words, right? Like, when did we expect 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds to have sight words? It's a fairly new concept. But it's fascinating because, like, a part of it's like, we've done this before. So as Church of the Brethren, if you look at, like, I know we're not all blood brethren, but if you look at Church of the Brethren as like a cultural group that came, like, they came from Germany. And Germans were seen as sort of brown and dirty and poor. Just saying. The British immigrants to the US thought Germans were kind of not really, well, I guess they're better than the Indians, but like, that was about what they had to say about German immigrants. And yet still the Germans became white, the Irish become white, the Italians become white. Like, there's this thing where, like, and what becoming white isn't about your skin color, right? Like, it's about becoming accepted and having access to wealth. And like, how does that happen and why does that happen? But the other thing that I think we're faced with, and I see this in our denomination a lot, is there's also the unbecoming of white. And what I say is the problem. So when I was a kid, the big thing was like, just say no. Like, this was like Nancy Reagan's big thing, right? Like, just say no. Black kids, and I went to like YMCA Black and Brown summer schools, and they'd be like, just say no. And they'd have the police come talk to us, and it was like a huge thing. And I look around and all of a sudden I'm like, dude, who's using drugs in this era? Like, it's not just a Black problem. Like, when it was the crack cocaine thing, it was seen as like a Black and brown problem. But now we have this whole like methamphetamine thing, and the same issues that were plaguing like Black families are now plaguing lower income white families. And when you talk about like Black families were shaped by eviction. Eviction is one of the hardest experiences a Black family can have. And then you look around and you're like, wait, we just went through a massive foreclosure that like lower income white people found themselves pushed out due to predatory lending too. And a generation ago, no white family ever really thought about their kid's school district. And now all of a sudden, white families have to think about this a lot. I'm like, dude, everything that happens to me happens to you all next. Black people get shot by the police, and we talk about this, but in fact, police in America shoot people more often than police in any other like westernized country. Like, white people in the US are more likely to be shot by their police officers than white people in England or Norway or Germany or anywhere else. Like, the reality is the system as a whole is going to disadvantage us all of us. And so like when you know, it's like it goes back to like the Freedman School. Like, we could all get on this bus and go on this journey together and get to a better place. Or we can pretend that some of us will get there, but realize that it's actually, like, some of us getting there is never the point. Josiah, I have a scripture. You want to read it? Thank you.
I would love to read it. So this is
Because it's Sunday.
Mark 14, verses 1 to 7. And I'm reading from the NRSV. Mark 14, 1 to 7. And it says, "It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people.' While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar, very costly ointment of nard. And she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, 'Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor.' And they scolded her. But Jesus said, 'Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me.'"
This is one of my favorite scriptures to think about the work of alleviating poverty and the work of the community. Because I feel like everybody says, "Oh, the poor will always be with you," and it becomes like, "Oh, we say that," and then we wash our hands, right? Like, "Oh, we can't fix that." But in fact, it's not even the fix, it's that the poor will always be with you, and you will always have the opportunity to show kindness. Which literally means, like, right now, when we hang up, the poor are there, and there's an opportunity for us to show kindness. When we wake up tomorrow morning, the poor will be there, and there is the opportunity to show kindness. And adding that second piece, for me, has revitalized and changed my faith. From saying the poor will always be there and looking at the sort of systemic thing that says, like, oh, it's always going to be there. Even Jesus said the poor are always going to be there. To saying, and Jesus said, even now I can always show kindness. For me, that has become a wellspring of hope and a wellspring of action in the midst of what can feel so daunting. And so I did just want to bring that to us as a group and to hold that opportunity and just to say, like, and we must always show that kindness to the children that may be disadvantaged in our own community, that kindness to the community itself, but that kindness, that opportunity will keep presenting itself over and over. And if you fail and you don't have it in you today and you drive past this person today, if today's the day that you get the text that says, email your senator, and you just don't have it in you, that opportunity will come again. There is always the opportunity to show that kindness.